How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Zayin, Daf 37 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends. Today's daf is, I'd say, relatively interesting. The basis, the foundation of it is an anecdote between Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah and his attendant, Rabbi Simlai, where Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah mentions to Rabbi Simlai that they had permitted the gezerah against, the gezerah that prohibited the oil, shemen shel ovdei kochavim, the oil of ovdei kochavim. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah had permitted that, to which Rabbi Simlai suggests that, well, why don't you also permit the gezerah prohibiting bread of ovdei kochavim? And that anecdote and that suggestion of Simlai serves as the basis and the launching pad for today's daf. So with that introduction and without further ado, we will jump in to daf Lamed Zayin of Masechta Avodah Zarah. We are on daf Lamed Zayin Omid Aleph, about 6 or so lines into the Omid Lamed Zayin Omid Aleph. The first word on the line is mistomich. Here we go. Mistomich va'azil. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah akisvei Rabbi Simlai Shamei. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah was on a shpatzir. He was walking and he was leaning on the shoulder of his trusty attendant, Rab Simlai. Amalei Simlai lo'yisa emesh bebeis hamedrash kisheitainu es hashemen. Simlai, you were absent yesterday from the Beis HaMedrash when we allowed the oil of Ovdei Kochavim. We permitted the gezerah. Of course, we've learned about the gezerah of shemen. We talked about it yesterday, did we not? I mean, it definitely came up yesterday, right? What was the main focus of yesterday's daf? Was it I don't even remember. It was the shemen. Yeah, it was after that they permitted the shemen. I think that was the main thrust of yesterday. And so Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah points out to Rabbi Simlai that you weren't in the Beis HaMedrash yesterday when we permitted the oil. Okay. Omar lo b'yameinu tatir af es hapas. To which Rabbi Simlai responds, and hopefully in our days we will keep going and permit the gezerah prohibiting bread as well. To say that the gezerah prohibiting pas akum will be permitted as well. We already saw Tosfos 2 days ago that you could argue that already. But anyways, okay. So Reb Simlai had suggested that they already should permit the gezerah prohibiting pas akum. Omar, to which Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah responds, Imkain karulan beis dina sharia. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah says to Rabbi Simlai, in principle, I agree with you. We should permit the gezerah against pas akum. But I'm concerned. What's my concern? My concern is, well, we've already permitted the shemen of Ovdei Kochavim. If we now are on like a crusade of sorts, or at least that would be the impression, and that's what he was concerned about, right? He says if we now move forward and permit pas akum as well, we will gain a reputation of being this permissive, this overly permissive, this overly almost zealous bezdin that just permits all the things, and that will and that would be a negative reputation. And Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah says, while I agree with you in principle about permitting the bread, I'm nervous that as a consequence, we will gain a negative reputation as an overly permissive bezdin. Right? In Kain, Karulan Bezdin Shire, they're going to call us an overly permissive bezdin Detnan, because after all, we learn in a Mishnah Hayed, Rabbi Yose of Tzereda, that Yose ben Yoezer testified about 3 permissions, 3 kulas, 3 leniencies. Number 1 being, right, this was Rabbi Yose ben Yoezer of Tzereda, one of the Zugis. Which was he even the first Was he even the first of the Zugis? Yossi ben Yose of Tzereda and Yossi ben Yochanan Ish Yerushalayim, I think, were the first Zugis. And then there was Yoshua ben Prachi and Ita Arabeli, Shim ben Shatach, and who was with Shimon? It was Yehudah ben Prachi, Shim ben Shatach, and who was with Shim ben Shatach? Yoshua ben Prachi and Ita Arabeli, Shim ben Shatach, and I'm forgetting who the partner with Shim ben Shatach was. Yehudah ben Tabai, probably. Shim ben Shatach and Yehudah ben Tabai, Shmai and Avtalion, followed finally by Hillel and Shammai. So I think Yossi ben Yose of Tzereda was mamash the first of the Zugis, already in the time of the Second Temple. It's also interesting to see the things that he's testifying about. Very interesting to see the things that we are preoccupied with nowadays, certainly, and also even in the Talmud Bavli. What were the main focuses on the Talmud Bavli? Also, interestingly, what the Bavli focuses on is different than what the Yerushalmi focuses on, and it's just interesting to see. It's interesting to see what way back when the main topics were. Rabbi Yose ben Yose of Tzereda testified al ayil kamza about a certain locust dachan, that it was pure, dachan, and that in the azara, the mashkin, the water and the blood in the azara are in the Beit Mitbachayim, by the, I guess, butchery area there, is pure. About the yikrov lemisov misav, and that somebody who touches and comes into contact with a corpse is going to be tameh. The Gemara is going to ask later on, but wait, that actually sounds like a stringency, not a leniency, to say that somebody touches a corpse is tameh, and also isn't that midoraisa? Anyways, we're going to get into that. But first of all, it's just interesting to see that we don't know much from Yossi ben Yose of Tzereda, and yet the three things that he's testifying about are all tumah and tara related. He lived in, I would imagine, in probably the second half of the Second Temple. But I guess when there was a Beis Hamikdash, tumah and tara was a lot more negei lemaise. So interesting to see what he was testifying about. So he permitted these three things. Again, we're going to see later how the tumah of the mace is actually a leniency. V'karule, you know what his reputation was for that? For permitting these three things? There's locust, the mashkin in the azor and the Beis Matbachaya, and the mace, tumas mace. The Karule Yosef Sharia. They said, oh yeah, that's Yosef Sharia. That's Yosef, the permissive one, the one who permits everything. So Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah quoted this incident, I guess you could say, this fact that Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda gained this reputation of being Yosef Sharia, and Rabbi Yehudah said, I don't want to be known as Yehudah Sharia. And therefore, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah says, I don't feel comfortable permitting also pas akum. Amalei, to which Rabbi Simlai responded to Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah, Hosom shara tlasu mar shara chada. To which Rabbi Simlai says, yeah, but what are you concerned about? Because I understand your concern, right? You don't want to be known as Yehudah Sharia, but it's different. Yossi ben Yose of Tzereda had permitted three things. What did you permit, Sachakol? Only shemen akum. That's all you had permitted. You only permitted one thing, not three. They won't call you Yehudah Sharia. Ve'ishari mar chada achrisa akati tartan hudahavyon. And continues Reb Simla, and he says, so you still, was it Jerry? So if you, but even if you permit one more thing, even if you permit pas akum, still, you're only at two. So Reb Simla argues, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah, you should have nothing to worry about. You should be able to permit the bread, and nobody's going to call you names. Omar late, to which Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah responds, on a sharai acharise. Yeah, but I permitted other things. So there are more things, and I am concerned about being called names. What else has Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah permitted that he was concerned that he would be too permissive? Titnan is learning in the Mishnah Zegitev im loy bosim ikan achnem osar chodesh. Gittin. Also from the very beginning of Masechta Ksubis, but also, of course, from Masechta Gittin. If a husband says to a wife, here is your divorce document, and it will kick in imlo basi mikanat 12 chodesh if I don't come back, if you don't see me, if I don't come back within 12 months. Umeis besoch 12 chodesh. And Itaka dies during that time, right? So a husband gives his wife a get, and he says to her, here's your get. We are not divorced right now. In 12 months from today, if I do not come back, we are divorced then. We are divorced then. Well, he doesn't say we are divorced then, but he says we are divorced. Okay? So, and then he died in the interim, right? Even let's say the next day, he died. Okay? So the shaila is, are they divorced or not? So again, it's not a husband gives a divorce document to his wife and says to her, this is your divorce document, and it will kick in if I don't come back within 12 months. And during that time, he died. So the question is this going to be a valid get or not? Is she considered divorced or is she considered widowed? Does she have to do yibum with his brother if there is a possibility of yibum, right? Are we talking about widow or divorcee? So, eino get. So the Mishnah says it is not a get because, as we know from Masechta Gittin, ein get la'achar misa. There is no posthumous. Dennis, I feel like it's posthumous. Posthumous. I don't know. There's no ein get la'achar misa. There are no gets that can be getted after somebody is dead. A get must get before the husband dies. V'tanya, and it's thought about it, Rabbi Seinu itirua linase, but Rabbi Seinu permitted her to get married. Faminan man Rabbi Seinu, and we say, who is this Rabbi Seinu? Who's Rabbi Seinu? Who permitted her to get married? Rabbi Yehudah, meaning who says that it's a valid get and therefore she's a divorcee, she doesn't have to worry about yibum. Man Rabbi Seinu, Rabbi Yehudah, Amar Shmuel, Beis Dina Disharu Mishcha. It's this, I'll tell you, well, it's the same Beis Din that allowed Shemen Shel Ovdei Kochavim. The same Beis Din that permitted oil of Ovdei Kochavim, i.e., the Beis Din of Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah, was also the same Rabbi Seinu that allowed this woman to get remarried without concern of yibum, i.e., it is a valid get. Sabila Rabbi Yose, because Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah holds like Rabbi Yose, wow, mamash, getting back into Noshim and Nezikin sugas. Shtar is very beautiful. I mean, it's really just an anecdote over here. But anyways, because Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah holds like Rabbi Yose, who says Zmanu shel shtar mochiach olav, that the time that is written into the document, right, the date and time on the document, proves when it is, right, proves from which point it is valid, i.e., that it should already be, so meaning it's considered as though he says, right, right? It's as if he says, we are divorced from now if I don't come back in 12 months. And since he died in the middle, they are considered divorced from the time that is written in the document. And that is why Rabbi Nesiah says that she's considered divorced and not widowed. V'amar Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Abba says, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah hora v'lo hodu lo kol shaito. But says Rabbi Abba that yes, while Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah may have made that ruling that she is divorced and been lenient to say that she can get remarried, however, his entire lifetime, his entire generation, his Beis Din did not agree with him. And right, some say the people in his Beis Din either kol shaito his entire lifetime or kol siato his entire Beis Din disagreed with him. So meaning if we wanted to say, right, we were trying to figure out, right, because what happened? There was this anecdote with Reb Simlai and Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah. Reb Simlai was urging Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah to permit pas akum. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah was concerned for his reputation. He was going to be called too permissive. And we said, well, aside from shemen and pas, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah claimed that he had permitted other things. We're trying to figure out what those other things are, right? Particularly, right, he was concerned about being called a bezdin shire, that not just he would be considered too permissive, but his bezdin would be considered permissive. And we're saying, what else did his bezdin permit? So we just suggested what they permitted was a woman to get remarried without having to do yibum or chalitza in a scenario of harez agitech im labasim mikan ve'ad shneim asar chodesh, and he dies in the middle, even though the Mishnah says not that she's a widow, right, that it's not a valid get. Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah allowed her to get remarried based on Rabbi Yose's opinion, that's opinion of Zmano Shashtar Mochiach Olav. So we see that Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah was permissive there. He was lenient there. So maybe that's another scenario where he's lenient. And we say that Enechanami, he was lenient there, but this Bezdin, the other people didn't agree with him. So this can't be brought as a example that would contribute to the reputation of his Bezdin being lenient, because his Bezdin wasn't lenient here, was not lenient here, only he was. This Bezdin didn't agree with him, so this wouldn't have contributed to their reputation, says the Gemara. Omar, where am I? Okay, fine. Omar le Rabbi Lazar, Lausava. Rabbi Lazar said to a certain elder who was in Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah's Bezdin. And Rabbi Lazar said to this elder, he says, Kisharisua, when Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah allowed this woman to get remarried, le'alter shrisua de lo osi odum malachish nemasar chodesh do'ikayim le'tanoi. So this is an interesting shaila that maybe you were wondering. I was wondering it when I was learning it initially. Maybe you were wondering it as well. That is she permitted to get remarried immediately from when the husband dies, or does she have to wait the full 12 months? Meaning, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah ruled that in a scenario where a husband gives a get to his wife and says that we are divorced if I don't come back in 12 months, and then he dies the next day. So Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah says, all of that he's betzim saying, so therefore he's dead, he's not coming back in 12 months, therefore she's divorced, because it's from the time that essentially that the get was given, right, from the earlier, from before he died. The question is, he's now dead. At what point is she considered divorced? Because after all, the tanai that he made, the deal was, we're divorced if I don't come back in 12 months. So does that mean that he's dead? He's obviously not coming back in 12 months, but does she still have to wait for the 12? That was the condition. If I don't come back in 12 months, obviously he's not coming back in 12 months, he's dead, but we still need to technically wait for the 12 months to be up and for him not to walk in the door. Do we say that you have to wait that full time, or do we say, from the fact of the matter is, he's not coming back, she can already get remarried now, from the day that the husband dies. So that is the shaila, and that is what Rabbi Lazar asked this elder who was there in the Bezdin of Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah when Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah allowed this woman to get remarried. Rabbi Lazar was asking this elder, so can you tell me more about what that psak was about? Did Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah allow her to get married immediately, or did she still have to wait for the 12 months to be up? Again, I'm going to read that again. Shrisua, where am I? Le'alter shrisua? Did they allow her to get remarried right away on the day that the husband died? Because at the end of the day, he's not coming back at all. So mainly, he's not going to come back in 12 months. That's obvious, that's for sure. Or Dilma, or do we say, nonetheless, yeah, you still have to technically wait for the 12 months to be up to her, because it's only at that point that the condition is met. When he does not come in the door after 12 months. So now the Gemara asks, why is Rabbi Lazar asking this question specifically based on the leniency of Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah? That when Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah was lenient and said that she can get remarried, was she allowed to get remarried right away, or did she have to wait till 12 months? Forget about Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah. You can even ask it directly on a Mishnah in Gittin. that says that when the husband explicitly says that the get is from now if I don't come back in 12 months, and he dies within the 12 months, have a get, it is going to be a valid get because it says me'achshav, from now, tonight, because 12 months, right? When he, okay, so let's just say simply for now, because when he doesn't come back in 12 months, so the t'nai happens, he didn't come back in 12 months, so they're divorced me'achshav, from now, from when he was still alive. So when he explicitly says me'achshav, from now, so then it is a valid get. And so let's say it's the same shaila. V'ti barlach, let's ask about the Mishnah itself. In this scenario, when he says me'achshav, the alto avegita, so should it be considered already a get immediately upon his death, when at that point we obviously know he won't be coming back in 12 months? The lo also is definitely not coming. Or dilma, or perhaps the achar yud beis chodesh to ikayim letnoi, or maybe we would nonetheless still have to wait for the 12 months to be up for him technically to not walk in the door, even though he's obviously not going to because he's dead. But we still have to technically wait for that experience to happen before she would be considered divorced. So why did Rabbi Elazar ask this elder about the incident with Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah? That seems to be less important than just simply going to the source or you're forgetting about important, just why not go to the source and ask about the Mishnah itself, that in the scenario of Me'achshav, where she is divorced, is she divorced immediately when he dies, or does she still have to wait for the 12 months to be up? Ein achinam. The Gemara says, yeah, you're right. Good question. Why didn't he ask about the source? But I'll tell you why I didn't ask about the Mishnah itself. Well, because Rabbi Elazar had a unique opportunity, which is he was actually speaking with somebody who was there at this incident where Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah allowed this woman to get remarried, and therefore Elazar says, well, you were there. Tell me about that incident that you experienced. Was it from now or was it then the 12 months? Yeah, Rabbi Elazar could have asked a random shaila about a Mishnah. He could have. But here he actually had somebody who could tell you a first-hand account of a Maaseh Shehoya Kachoya. So Elazar asked about that. That's why he was asking about that particular incident, because he had the opportunity to ask somebody who was stuck there. So now, on a similar note, Amar Abaye says, Abaye, if a husband says to his wife, this is your get when the sun comes out. I didn't actually look up what that means. I assume it means when the sun comes out. That's what it sounds like to me. That's how I'm going to explain it. I hope I'm explaining it correctly. Even if I'm explaining it technically incorrectly because I'm translating the words wrong, the principle is, I have to imagine, is still the same, but I assume I'm translating it rightly. It's just a funny word. What does that mean? Why didn't you say like alos hashachar or something like that? But anyways, whatever. Fine, maybe it's a technical term. It sounds to me like basically the husband says that when the sun rises, whether it's initially, I don't know, something to do with sunrise, at some point of sunrise, we are divorced, okay? So I'm just going to say sunrise. So if a husband says to his wife, when the sun comes up, whatever, when the sun comes up, we are divorced, and he dies that night in his sleep. Ooh, sheesh. Well, he had been pretty clear that it's when the sun comes up, right? And the thing is that even if we say, so it's like now, but he also had said, it's like, Rashi explains that it's in the equivalent of me'achshav ula achar misa, basically, which is a scenario that we had in Gittin, and in that case, it wouldn't be a valid star. So in that case, it is not a valid get, okay? If he says, we will be divorced when the sun comes up, and then he dies in his sleep, so they will not be divorced. She's a widow. She's not a divorcee because he died before the sun came up. So Amar Abaye says, I'm reading again, everybody agrees that in the scenario of that we are divorced when the sun comes up, he's saying that we're divorced when the sun comes up, and therefore if he dies in the middle of the night, get la'achar misahu, it would be considered a get after death. No such thing. There can't be gets after deaths. And she's a widow, not a divorcee. Amanas. sheteitze chama min artika. We are divorced under the condition that the sun will come out. They are divorced. Me'achshav kamer le. He's be'etzim saying we are divorced from now, under the condition that the sun comes out, which obviously it will. And even if he dies that night, it is a valid tanai nonetheless. And when the sun comes up, inevitably rises the following morning, they are divorced from me'achshav, from the time that the get was given. V'get mechaim hu, and it's considered a get from while he was still alive. The Amar Rav Huna, like Rav Huna says, and here there's a note that adds Amar Rebbe, in the name of Rebbe. Why is that awesome? It's awesome because this was the opinion of Rebbe Masechta Gittin, and that's why, of course, we remember from Masechta Gittin, Kol ha'omer al manas kol me'achshav dami. I think it came up several times in Masechta Gittin, like this. This seems like familiar to me, that this was the opinion of Rebbe, that Kol ha'omer al manas, that whoever says on the condition that ka'omer me'achshav dami, it's as though he's saying from now. And therefore, so what have we said so far? We said if he says that this is your get, when the sun comes out, and then he dies before the sun comes out, well, they're not divorced. She's a widow. If he says that this is your divorce, this is your get under the condition that the sun will come out, well, it's from now, and it's a valid divorce. She's a divorcee. Lo nechliku ella, where's the machlekes be'im teitzei, right? Because what was the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah earlier? He says, and similarly here, right? It's the same idea. And therefore, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah would argue here as well that it is, and he's basically saying, me'achshav. Be'imteitze Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah savar la Rabbi Yose, that Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah holds like Rabbi Yose the Amar, who says that the time written on the document proves the intent of, it's basically the equivalent of me'achshav im teitze, me'achshav im teitze, right? That you don't need to say me'achshav because you wrote the time for that purpose. V'avle k'me'ayom im mati is basically the equivalent of from today if I die. K'me'achshav. Wait, what's it? V'havale k'me'ayom im mati, k'me'achshav im mati. Right? It's basically saying from now. V'rabbanan leislu to Rabbi Yose, whereas the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah don't hold like Rabbi Yose. As Taisus points out that, at least not in this particular case, there could be other cases by other stars where they will hold like Rabbi Yose, but not here. V'havalei k'zagitech im mati greda, and therefore it's be'etzen zagitech im mati, which is similarly, zagitech im mati, and that would be get lachar misa, and in valid according to the rabbis who argue with Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah. Gufa, now exploring the scenarios or the instances of Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzereda. He had mentioned that he was lenient by grasshoppers, by the mashkin base matbechaya, as well as somebody touching a corpse. We're going to explore these three scenarios, and if I'm not mistaken, that is going to take us to the end of today's daf. Says the Gemara Gufa, we said earlier, Hey Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzereda, that Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzereda testified about al ayol kamtza dachan, that a particular grasshopper is. Speaking of grasshoppers, I just had a little fly jump onto my Gemara. I don't know why. For some reason, my garbage smelled pretty bad. I can't figure out why. I don't think there was really anything in there. I think just like vegetables. Let's be honest, I haven't really been eating. So I don't know why there should be fruit flies nearby. I threw out the trash. Those fruit flies will probably go away. But okay, perfect time. We're talking about locusts. This isn't quite a locust, and I wouldn't want to eat this, nor would I want to eat locusts, but I'll upon him. Where am I? So al ayil kam tzadachan, that a particular kind of locust is pure, you can eat it. Okay, technically, right? Chagovim, grasshoppers are I don't know, locust, grasshopper. I don't really know. I don't really eat that stuff. Anybody at Babylon Talmud eat grasshoppers? Or just like cows and things? Anyways, where are we? did I ever tell you that? Did I ever tell you that story? Yeah, I mentioned the other day that Josh Weinberg is my posek. Again, I don't know why. I don't think he's a rabbi or anything, but who else am I going to call when I have shilas? So I called Josh Weinberg. I remember years ago. I'm talking about, I think 12 years ago. I think like 12, maybe it was 11 and a half years ago. I was cooking a chicken soup back when I was eating chickens. And maybe I must have told you the story. I've been babbling for 5.5 years. It must have come out at some point. But anyways, I was making a chicken soup. And I think a fly fell into it. Maybe it was related to this fly. Anyways, so I called Josh Weinberg. I said, what do? A fly fell into my chicken soup. And then Nafalia Asimon. Then I realized, wait a second, there's a dead chicken in there. Uncle Pano, I must have mentioned this story already. Anyways, okay. So and the fly is the least of my problems. Okay, so where are we? So fine. So where are we? So Gufa, hey, Rabbi Yose ben Yose, you stood I'll come to Dachen, but Mashke be mat bechaya Dachen, and that the mashkin in the base mat bechaya in the Azara is also pure, which we'll get to in a few minutes. The yikra of the misa masav, and thirdly, that somebody who touches a corpse, who comes into contact with a corpse, is themselves becomes tummy. V'karule Yosef Shara, and they called him Yosef, the permitting one, the overly permitting one. My ayol kamsa, what is this ayol kamsa type of grasshopper? A papa Omar says a papa shoshiva. It's a shoshiva grasshopper. Now, what's unique about the shoshiva grasshopper? What's unique about the shoshiva grasshopper is that it has a long head. The main sugya here looks like it's from Chulin, which we will get to. I think we talked about recently when we would get to Chulin, I think in about maybe 5 months or so. Anyway, so it talks about that basically we learn out grasshoppers from these 4 grasshoppers, which are the Arbe, Salam, Chargol, and Chogov. I just read for that from Rashi. But basically all of those 4 grasshoppers, they all have small heads. Now this Shoshiva has a larger head, and the question is, this large head locust, if you're interested in eating locusts with large heads, so is it kosher or not? So Rab Chia, where am I? So Rab Papa Amar Shoshiva. So Rab Papa says we're talking. So a ayol kamsa is a Shoshiva grasshopper, I guess. Rab Chia Bar Ami Mishmei Deula Amar Sosvil, that it is a Sosvil grasshopper. Rab Papa Amar Shoshiva. The Papa says it's a Shoshiva grasshopper, and the question is, what do you do if the grasshopper has a long head like this Shoshiva grasshopper? So those who disagree with Yose ben Yose of Tzereda hold that the long-headed grasshopper is osir, you can't eat it. Mutter. The other one holds that the long-headed grasshopper is, is mutter. I don't know what I just read, but it's mutter. It's permitted, and that, of course, would be Yosef ben Yoezer, Ish, Tzereda of Chia, Bar Ami, Mishmei Deula, Omar, Sosvil, Burosho. So, who is this? Reb Chia Bar Ami, Mishmei Deula said that we were talking about a Sosvil grasshopper. Now, the thing with the Sosvil grasshopper is that its wings covered the majority of its body, but barely. And the question is, do the wings need to clearly cover the majority of the body, or is barely covering enough? So brosho aruch kulamelo pligid de osur. So in terms of a long-headed grasshopper, everyone agrees no dice. Of course it's osur. You can't eat that. V'acha bechnof of chofen as rubo idea dechak kamiflige. The shaila is, what happens when you have a grasshopper whose wings just barely cover the majority of its body? It's not obvious. Myself ruba koldu ba'inan, myself ruba de minker ba'inan. So Rabbi Yose ben Yose said, that's enough. That's okay. You just need, so long as it's the majority, even if it's barely a majority, that's fine. However, those who argue on him hold that it has to be an obvious, a recognizable majority. The Mashke Bey Matbechaya Dachan. Secondly, Yose ben Yose of Tzereda said that the mashkin, that the liquids in the Bey Matbechaya, in the Azara, were pure. Tell me about this. My dachan, what does pure mean? Rav Amar dachan mamish. Rav means, it literally means pure. They cannot become tummy. Impossible. They can't become tummy. At least so I understand. This came up, I think the main sugya of this might have been in Psachim. That was complicated stuff. I think Kodshim, Chevra. I have a feeling that we're going to get to a lot of tumah and tara and Kodshim. I'm a little bit nervous, but hopefully we will do a good job. Hopefully we'll understand that real good. Anyways, so Rav says that these mashkin are mamish tahor. Ushmuel Amar, where Shmuel says dachan miltamei acherim aval tumas atzman yeshben. Whereas Shmuel argues with Rav and says that the mashkin beit matbechaya, they themselves can contract tumah, but they can't impart tumah on other things. That is where Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda drawed the line and says that right there, dachan, they're tahor, that they cannot be mitami other things, according to Shmuel. Rabba madachan mamish, when Rav says that they are mamish tahor, that even the mashkin themselves that come into contact with tumah remain tahor, because over tumah's mashkin derabanan, because Rav holds that the tumah of mashkin is midirabanan, that the concept of liquids becoming tameh is entirely midirabanan. And Rashi points out, and therefore, what do you learn out from the? So how does he explain v'chomashka sher yishase? So mishani my yitma hechsher means that they could be machsher. I assume what it means that they could be machsher other things to become tamei, but they themselves cannot become tamei mida oraisa, according to Rav. So the concept of liquids becoming tamei is entirely rabbinic, and the rabbis, when they rabbinically added tumah to liquids, made an exception for mashkin bei matbechaya. They made an exception for the water and the blood in the bei matbechaya, in the Zarah. There is no tumah there for that mashkin. Shmuel Amar, where Shmuel disagrees with Rav and holds dachan milatame acherim, that the mashkebe matbechaya are tahor to the extent that they will not impart their own tumah on other things. But they themselves can become tamei kasavim, because Shmuel holds tumas mashkin de oraisa, that tumas mashkin is de oraisa. Midoraisa, liquids can become tamei. However, the tamei acherim de abanon, but liquids being matami other things is rabbinic. B'chigazu abanon b'mashkin de ama b'mashkin b'mashkin b'matbechai logazu. And when the rabbis made their injunction that mashke could be mitame, right? That tome mashke could be mitame other things, right? Tome mashke, according to Shmuel, could become tome midoraisa, but imparting tumah onto other things is purely rabbinic in nature, according to Shmuel. And he says that when the rabbis made the gezerah of mashkin imparting tumah and other things, they made an exception for mashke beimat b'chaya, that the mashke beimat b'chaya, that the water and the blood in the beimat b'chaya, in the Zarah, they can become tamei, but will not impart tumah on other things. So that was the machlokes Rav and Shmuel concerning the leniency of Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda when he says mashke beimat b'chaya dachan. Rav says it means that literally they are pure, they cannot contract tumah. Shmuel says they can contract tumah because that's the oraisa, but the abundant aspect of making other things tamei, that was waived by Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda. Imparting tumah is probably the word I was thinking of. And now for the final segment of today's daf, which is the third and final leniency of Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda, which was that somebody who comes into contact with a corpse becomes tamei. Here we go. Yikrav lemisa misav, and that a person who comes into contact with a corpse, they themselves become tamei. V'karu le Yosef Shara, and they called him Yosef the permissive one. Yosef asra miboyle. Fact, the Gemara, why would this be considered a leniency? Based on this, it should be called Yosef the stringent. He's saying that people are becoming tamei. That's a stringency. V'od, and more so deoraisi. Also, one second, that's not a rabbinic thing. The Torah, of course, says D'chsib b'chol asher yiga al pnei hasodeh b'chalul cherv or b'meis v'gomer, that somebody, where's this pasuk from? That somebody, Bamidbar, this must be coming up Is it talking in this week's? Where is this? I wonder if it's talking in this week's parsha, or maybe it was last week's parsha. I have to check. Maybe it's in today's Aliyah. I haven't yet done today's Aliyah. Anyways, I remember when I was in Camp Mora Shakol, that was an intense place. Anyways, I remember when I was there 2 summers. My first summer there, Rabbi Sobolovsky, he gave a shir, I think, on this pasuk of Cherv Arei Kechol. Was it from this pasuk? Maybe. Yeah, probably. Bachal Cherv Arei Kechol. Probably around this time, it was the summer, probably around this time. How many years ago? Ooh, sheesh, probably 20 years ago. Akoponim. So, where are we? B'chal cherev o be'meis v'gomer. So we see that there's a d'oraisa, right? Person comes into contact with a corpse, they become tameh. This is no chiddush of Yossi ben Yoezim. D'oraisa de yikrav tameh. Well, says the Gemara, which it will reject and clarify in just now. But mida oraisa. So let's talk about Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, okay? So if Reuven is the corpse, there's taka. Anyways, fine. Reuven, let's say Reuven is the corpse, and Shimon touches Reuven. So mida oraisa, if Shimon touches Reuven, yeah, of course, right? Reuven the corpse. Shimon touches Reuven, of course, Shimon is going to be tameh. The yikrav b'diyikrav tahor. However, if Levi touches Shimon, mida oraisa, and again, if you're confused, we're going to reject it in a second, but mida oraisa, if Levi touches Shimon, he's tahor. Now remember, let's just do a refresh for a second. A corpse is an avi avos hatumah. It is the most tameh thing. In avi avos hatumah. Levi, who touches Reuven the corpse, Levi becomes an av hatumah, because he touched an avi avos hatumah. So Shimon, I hope I said Shimon. Shimon touches Reuven. Shimon becomes an av hatumah. If Shimon now touches Levi, Levi becomes a rishon l'tumah, because a av hatumah could be mitame adam v'kelim, people and vessels. So Levi becomes a rishon l'tumah, because he touched an av. He came in contact with an av hatumah, who came into contact with an avi avos hatumah. So now, we had just said that mida oraisa, Shimon, who touched Reuven the corpse, becomes tameh. However, Levi, who touches Shimon, would not be tameh. I'm going to read that again. The oraisa, the yikrav tameh, Shimon is tameh. The yikrav b'diyikrav tar, but Levi, who touched Shimon, would be tar. V'asu inu, and the rabbis made a gezerah of a gazer, and they decreed afilu diyikrav b'diyikrav, that the rabbis came and said that even Levi would be tameh, that Levi who touches Shimon would also be tameh. V'asa iu, and then came Yossi ben Yoezer, the hero, the ukma d'oraisa, and he rolled back the rabbinic decree to say, let's roll that back and stick with the d'oraisa, which is that only, what was the lashon that he said? The yikrav lemisa mesav, only the one who touches the corpse is tameh. Let's roll back to the OG d'oraisa way to say that just Shimon who touches Reuven the corpse is tameh, but Levi who touches Shimon is tahor. Levi is tahor, and therefore it was a leniency, because the rabbis were being strict and saying that Levi is tameh. Rabbi Yose ben Yosef of Tzereda was being lenient to say that Levi is tahor. Okay, v'ukma d'oraisa the yikrav. Okay, so now frekte Gemara, as I had pointed out, that as maybe everybody at Babylon Talmud was wondering, the yikrav b'diyikrav nami d'oraisa. He who? But wait a second. Levi being tameh for having touched Shimon, who touched Reuven the corpse, that's all d'oraisa. Of course, Shimon touches Reuven the corpse. Shimon is tameh for 7 days in the paraduma, that whole thing. Levi, who touches Shimon, becomes a rishon l'tumah, and he's just tameh till the evening, no paraduma or anything like that. But that's all d'oraisa. The pasuk says, "V'chol asher yiga bo atameh yitma," and whoever comes into contact with Shimon becomes tameh themselves. So Levi is going to be tameh. So amru rabbanon kame de rove. So the rabbis said before Rave, Mishmei de Ma'azutra Bedi Rav Nachman, in the name of Ma'azutra Bedi Rav Nachman, D'Amar Mishmei de Rav Nachman. So Be'etzim, the rabbis came to Rave and Be'etzim quoted Rav Nachman. that the oraisa, the yikra b'chiburin tumas shiva, shelo b'chiburin tumas erev. The also inu v'gaza afilu shelo b'chiburin tumas shiva, v'asa ivuk the oraisa zel. So, the rabbis came to Rava and explained in the following way. I'll explain it outside and then I'll read it inside again. What they explained to Rava was, and they claimed that this was in the name of Rav Nachman, was that here's the deal. Shimon touched Reuven the corpse. Shimon is now an Ava Tumah, 7 days of Tumah, Para Aduma on day 3 and day 7, the whole thing. Levi touches Shimon. So it depends. If when Levi touched Shimon, Shimon was still touching Reuven, okay? So basically, Levi is touching Reuven through Shimon, you can kind of say. So that's what chiburin is, the connection, that they're all connected. Well, in that case, even Levi is an Ava Tumah. Even Levi is telling me 7 days, Para Aduma, that whole thing. I assume that's what it means, Para Aduma and everything. It's Tumah Shiva. I assume that includes Para Aduma. Now, if Levi touches Shimon, when Shimon is no longer touching Reuven, okay, Shimon touched a corpse. He's not touching a corpse anymore. Levi now comes into contact with Shimon. So then Levi just becomes a Rishon L'Tumah, and he'll be tummy until the evening, goes to the mikveh, and it's all done that way. And the rabbis came, though, and said, you know what? We're going to say that in all scenarios, regardless of if Shimon is still touching Reuven or not, Levi, when he touches Shimon, will have tumas shiva. He's going to be tummy for 7 days. The rabbis came and said that chiburin, no chiburin, Levi is going to be tummy for 7 days. And then Yosi ben Yose of Tzereda and rolled that back to the Doraisa, which is only if Shimon is still touching Reuven, will Levi be tummy for 7 days. But if Shimon is no longer touching Reuven, Levi will only be tummy until the evening. So that was the leniency that he rolled back the Gzera D'Rabbanan to just the pure D'Oraisa implementation, and that was a leniency. So let's read that inside. But they said in the name of Nachum that the Oraisa, that Mida Oraisa, the Yikra b'chiburin, that if Levi touches Shimon while Shimon is still touching Reuven the corpse, tumas shiva, then that will be, then Levi is tamei tumas shiva. Shelo b'chiburin, but if when Levi touches Shimon, Shimon is no longer touching Reuven the corpse, well then, tumas erev. Well then it is only tumah. So then Levi is simply a rishon l'tumah. He's tummy till the evening. Vasu inu, but the rabbis came, v'gozer, and they made a gezerah, afilu shelo b'chiburin, that even in a scenario where when Levi touched Shimon, Shimon was no longer touching Reuven, tumas shiva, still Levi will be tummy for 7 days. V'asa iu, and came Yosi ben Yose of Tzereda and rolled it back, vukma d'oraisa, to the d'oraisa implementation, which is that if Levi touches Shimon, when Shimon is no longer touching Reuven, Levi will simply be an ava, it will be a rishon l'tumah until the evening. Fact the Gemara d'oraisa mahi. What is this d'oraisa implementation? Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, hanergeya b'meis l'chonevish adam v'tamei shivas yomim. One pasuk says that if Shimon touches Reuven the corpse, he will be tummy for 7 days. Uchsiv v'chol asher yiga bo atamei yitma. Another pasuk says that anybody who comes to contact with Shimon will be tummy. The implication being yitma, tummy, just like Shimon is. Right? The implication of this pasuk is that if Levi comes into contact with Shimon, Yitma, Levi will be just as tummy as Shimon is, i.e. tumas shiva. But a third pasuk says va'nefesh anogas titma ha'orev. But a third pasuk that says that Levi will only be tummy until the evening. That's all. Okay, so how could that be? Is Levi tummy for 7 days or 1 day? So kan b'chiburin, kan shelo b'chiburin, and the answer is that, well, it depends. If Shimon is still touching Reuven, well then if Shimon is still touching Reuven, then Levi will be tummy for 7 days. If Shimon is no longer touching Reuven, Levi will be tummy only until the evening. Amrlu Rava responds to these rabbis who made this claim in the name of Rav Nachman that it's talking about chiburin, no chiburin. Lav amina lechu, didn't I say to you, lo tislu be bukesrike Rav Nachman. Don't attribute empty jugs to Rav Nachman. Don't attribute to Rav Nachman narishkeit, things that are not true. Hachi Amar Rav Nachman, this is what Rav Nachman said. Sofek tumah b'shus harabim mitulahen. What Yose ben Yose of Tzereda permitted was related to Sofek tumah b'shus harabim. He said that when you have Sofek tumah sheretz, right, you're not sure if you're tummy by sheretz, in rishus harabim, it is mutter. In rishus hayochid, it is forbidden. That is what Yose ben Yose of Tzereda permitted, was to say that if a person is Sofek tumah sheretz in rishus harabim, he is tahor. That was the kula of Rabbi Yose ben Yose of Tzereda. But this isn't from Yose ben Yose of Tzereda. This is from Sota. Masota rishus hayachid av tumah rishus hayachid. Right. Sota, of course, is a Sofek tumah. Right. That we don't know if she had an affair. Right. She was v'nistra v'hi nitma. Right. So it says that she secluded herself. We don't know what happened in there. If we knew what happened in there, then we would be able to know what to do. But we don't know what happened in there. And it says v'nistra v'hi nitma, and we consider her to be tamei. And right, it says masota rishus hayachid, just like obviously sota is happening in a private place. So avtuma b'rishus hayachid. So also Sofek tumah b'rishus hayachid. Right. So sota is a Sofek that's happening b'rishus hayachid, and we're saying tamei. So also Sofek tumah b'rishus hayachid is tamei. Where am I? Okay. But Sofek tumah b'rishus Rabim would be tahor. So again, Rava says that what Rav Nachman said is that Yose ben Yose of Tzereda permitted Sofek tumah b'rishus harabim. To which the Gemara asks, but what do you mean Yose ben Yose of Tzereda permitted that? We learn it out from Sota. So Rabbi Yochanan halacha the ein morin kain. Well, Rabbi Yochanan says that, well, technically that is the halacha, but we wouldn't tell people that. We wouldn't advertise that because we were concerned about Sofek tumah b'rishus hayachid, which is tummy, so we wouldn't advertise, we wouldn't tell people that Sofek tumah b'rishus harabim is permitted. Ve'asa iu, but Ken Yose ben Yose of Tzereda ve'ori lei oruye, and he told the people, no, let's be clear, Sofek tumah b'rishus harabim is permitted. Also in a price like this, Rabbi Yehudah Omer says, Rabbi Yehudah korus noatz loem ve'omar, that Rabbi Yose ben Yose of Tzereda put up beams in, well, I guess between rishus harabim and rishus hayachid. V'amar, he says ad kan rishus harabim, ad kan rishus hayachid, and he clearly demarcated, this is where rishus harabim ends, this is where rishus hayachid begins. Until here is rishus harabim and Sofek tumah is tahor. This would be considered rishus hayachid and Sofek tumah is tamei. And Rabbi Yose ben Yose was very vocal about Sofek tumah b'rishus harabim being permitted. Also, the comment of Rabbi Yanai, when people would come before Rabbi Yanai and saying that they are Sofek tamei b'rishus harabim, he would say to them, Hamaya b'shikisa d'benahara zilu tvoli. He would say, look, go to the mikveh. Keilu. What Rabbi Yanai is saying is, enachinami Sofek tumei b'rishus harabim is tahor, but if you can go to the mikveh, just go to the mikveh. If we have if we're not sure about the truma become tummy, and you can't, if it's tummy, what are you going to do? You can't put it in the mikveh. So in a situation like that, we say Sofek tamei b'rishus harabim is tahor. But a person who can simply go to the mikveh will say, go to the mikveh anyways. Chevre, that was daf lamed zayin of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Interesting daf, in my opinion, though I tend to think most dafs are interesting, I guess. The sort of vibe of this daf was, or the high level concept of this daf was, it started with this little story with Rabbi Simlai and Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah talking about Rabbi Simlai suggested to Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah that he should permit the gezerah prohibiting pas akum, to which Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah responded, well, then I'll be like Yose ben Yose of Tzereda, who they called Yosef Sharia, and they'll call me Yehudah Sharia. And that kind of got into a discussion of, well, how permitting was Yose ben Yose of Tzereda? Was Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah equally permitting? We saw that, well, Rabbi Yehudah Nesiah permitted a woman to get remarried, and based on, depending on the wording of the condition of the husband, it would then die. That whole kind of thing. And then we kind of explored Yosef ben Yose of Tzereda and the things that he permitted, and we looked into those a bit. That was the Daf Lamed Zayin of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Tomorrow we will continue on these Gezeros talking about Bishul Akum, which is a very interesting sugya. So I will see you all tomorrow. Peace.